Am I working, Dan? All right, cool. Um, so I'm very excited to be able to teach the book of Hebrews. As Carrie kind of mentioned, the book of Hebrews is a lengthy book in the sense, not so much like it has a million chapters in it, or even that many words, but the words are so dense, and there are so many of them. When you couple them, it is an extremely profound book. It is full of so much depth and understanding to be mined out of it as far as our understanding of God, who He is, how Jesus fits into the plan of salvation, foreshadowing, patterns, types, all my favorite stuff. So I'm very, very, very excited to talk about that. So we're not going to talk about it. We're going to talk about Leviticus. All right? I want to start with the sacrificial system specifically, mainly focusing on Leviticus. The reason is this. Hebrews draws a lot of the argument that it makes for the supremacy of Christ from the Old Testament, specifically the Psalms, as well as figures within the Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial system that accompanies that priesthood. So, I'm not going to be able to cover all of that right now. Obviously, it's going to have to be divided up, but I'm taking the advice of a good friend of mine, a preacher back home in Florida, who taught this as a college course, actually, and he recommended spending at least one class period going over the sacrificial system. So, that is what I plan on doing. A lot of it, I'm just kind of going to breeze through. I made a bunch of slides, and I'm not going to dwell a ton of time on it and go over just tons of scriptures. It's just something that I want to refresh all of our minds for those who are familiar with it, and those that aren't. This is going to be something very enlightening, I hope, that will help your understanding of what's to come later in Hebrews. Okay? Any of the pictures that you think are historically inaccurate, you're right, they probably are. But I picked them because they look cool, and just to keep your attention. So, I did the best I could. You can only show the same scene of like an animal being laid on the altar so many times before you start running out of them. So anyway, the sacrificial system here. What this was about was the covenant between God and Israel. God had made this contract, essentially, with the Israelites. It's a promise, but it's from both sides. The Israelites had their end of the bargain to keep up, and God had His. Spoiler alert, God always kept His end of the bargain up. The Israelites did not. Essentially, the Israelites were to obey the commands of God, and they would receive His blessings. If they were to disobey, they'd receive curses. Because God and His infinite knowledge understood they're going to struggle with this, I'll provide a way to restore this relationship that they've damaged whenever they disobey me. That's where we get the sacrificial system. So these are the basic parts of that system. You have the tabernacle, which ultimately became the temple. But I'm going to focus on the tabernacle just because. You have the priesthood, and then you have the sacrificial rituals themselves. So the tabernacle was made up of basically two components. You had the actual meeting place, as it's called, kind of like the dwelling, and then the outer courtyard area. That was marked off by some curtains suspended between bronze poles. Within that courtyard, you had the altar, the laver. Laver is just kind of a fancy word for like a big bronze dish. I'll show you some pictures. And every single Israelite was able to enter the courtyard. That's important because as we move through the parts of this tabernacle and even kind of extend into what that means for us today and the pattern that demonstrates, you're going to see it starts becoming extremely exclusive as to who can enter where and do what. The courtyard, the altar, artist's rendering of it, maybe it looked like this, maybe not. We have descriptions of it, obviously. That's where we're coming up with this. But basically what you have is a square altar. It's about 7.5 feet on each side. It's made of wood and overlaid with bronze. There were 4 horns that were formed on those corners. Those have more significance in other aspects of Israelites' daily life, but I'm not going to focus on that again. I'm just kind of breezing through these different items. You have the laver. It's a large bronze basin with a bronze stand. The priests were required to wash themselves before entering the tabernacle or offering incense. It was also used to wash sacrifices in certain circumstances after they'd been slaughtered. So it was used essentially for ritual washing of some type. The golden lampstand. So now we've moved out of the courtyard and we're now in the holy place, sometimes referred to as the meeting tent. It's divided into two sections here. You have the holy place, which is everything from the front entrance to the curtain. It's a special type of curtain that divides it from the most holy place. So now we are in the holy place, and you have these items in here. You have the golden lampstand, the altar of incense, the table of the bread of the presence. I prefer that phrase. Many of you have probably heard it as the showbread, right? I prefer bread of the presence. There's a certain connotation of that. And then we see that priests were the only ones allowed to enter the holy place. So your normal, everyday Israelite, your lay person, was not allowed to enter the holy place. Only priests. They also had an incense altar in there. Roughly would look like this. It was made of wood and it was overlaid with gold. It was square, about 18 inches on each side and 3 feet tall. It also had horns. It's a common theme that you'll see with the different altars. It was placed in front of the curtain of the most holy place. And the high priest was directed to use it strictly for incense. You were not supposed to put anything else on it except incense, with one exception, and that was on the Day of Atonement, would be sprinkled on it. And there's huge significance to that. The lampstand, it was made of pure gold, and it was a single piece consisting of 7 branches. I couldn't imagine how difficult that would have been to make. Just one solid piece of gold that had been turned into this sort of intricate branching lampstand. It's amazing. It was used to provide light. Now, it doesn't seem all that significant, but again, as we're going to wander through Hebrews, keeping some of these things in mind, it becomes much more apparent why this is. It's unfortunately going to be kind of a long way off, but I'm sure you can already guess. This was to be kept perpetually burning by the high priest. Okay? That was their job, was to keep it burning, and they would refill it with olive oil. The table of the bread of the presence. It was made of acacia wood, and it was overlaid with pure gold. It held the bread of the presence and the other utensils that were used to accompany it, such as serving utensils, vessels for oil, salt, things of that nature. 12 loaves specifically were made according to the specific instructions that God had given them. The high priest was to present new loaves every Sabbath. So they would sit there untouched until the next Sabbath, at which point the high priest would remove all of those and place new ones on there. The priests were allowed to eat from it on certain occasions, though, with certain feasts and holidays and things of that nature. So now we've moved from the holy place into the most holy place. The most holy place had one thing in it. It does bear, it's worth noting, though, that it was separated by this very special curtain that becomes of much greater significance later on, as we'll read about in the Gospel of Matthew. But the Ark of the Covenant was kept inside. Okay? Anybody who's seen Indiana Jones knows exactly why the Ark of the Covenant was important. It's because the Nazis wanted it. That's why it was important. So the Ark of the Covenant was, almost literally the centerpiece of the tabernacle. It was held in a very special room, behind a curtain, behind another place that normal people couldn't get to, behind another outer perimeter that sort of kind of kept people away. You get what I'm saying? This is a very important piece, and here's why. It was made of wood and is overlaid with gold on the inside and out. It contained the stone tablets of the law. It contained a pot of manna and also Aaron's staff. Okay, Aaron's staff was the sign that he was selected as the high priest. When there was a dispute among the Israelites about who it should be, the elders laid their staffs in a room, and Aaron's staff budded. It budded, it was a miracle by God, of course. It budded and it actually produced almonds. That was a sign that Aaron was to be chosen as the high priest. What I found as I was reading about this, when God gives the directions about how to make this ark, and you can see in the picture here, that's roughly what I would imagine it would look like. Other people have slightly different interpretations. We do the best we can with what it is that we can read. But what I found most significant about that was God describes how it was to be made, and then at the very end of it he says, I will meet you there. Again, kind of alluding to stuff that's kind of extremely important, extremely profound statement. I will meet you there at the Ark of the Covenant. So now we move on from the tabernacle, we're going to talk about the priesthood itself. Moses' brother, Aaron, was selected by God to be the high priest. Okay? Aaron's brothers and sons, who were referred to as Levites, because they were all from the tribe of Levi, were selected by God to be his priests. And what I mean selected, they weren't individually selected. It was anyone who is of the tribe of Levi was going to be a priest. They were from that priestly tribe. Their main function was as an intermediary for the people of Israel and God, right? So Israel would worship God, and the priests would help with the intercession of that worship with God. They lived in a very distinctly consecrated way from the rest of the people. What do I mean by that? They had special garb that they wore. They had a special job that only they could do. Nobody else could do what they did. They were to ritually wash themselves in certain ways. They were allowed to do certain things that the other people could not. So they were very distinct. And it was because God had chosen them specifically for that function. They offered the sacrifices on the people's behalves. They cared for the tabernacle. And they also received provisions from God. The Levites couldn't work a normal job, if you will. They couldn't go out and be a tent maker or a sheep herder or something like that. They were wholly dedicated to administering to God, the worship from the Israelites as well as taking care of the tabernacle. And so God, again, in his infinite wisdom, designed it this way. Listen, you're going to serve me. You are mine. That's kind of how he describes it. You belong to me, but don't worry, I'm going to take care of you. And so he would offer them provisions through, as we'll see, this sacrificial system. This, you can't read that, obviously. But I wanted to put it on here just because it has a very good breakdown of Leviticus and the different feasts and the different types of sacrifices. All in all, if you want a copy of this, I would love to give it to you. I found it extremely helpful. So that's all that is. So here's the question. Why sacrifices? Why do we think? Why sacrifices? The sacrificial system was not a man-made effort to appease a vengeful God. That's typically how it's characterized by people who don't understand or perhaps want to be hostile towards what the Bible says. But it's rather the process that was actually prescribed by God to the people he loved. He cared for them, and he entered into a covenant relationship with them. Okay? The bottom line is, sin existed, and it had to be dealt with. This was God's way of dealing with it. Again, God showed his love through prescribing the system. It was not a way to just appease him to make him feel better about you. It's a way that he showed his love. You want to come back to be with me? I want you to come back with me as well. Here's how we're going to deal with it. What I think was interesting too, talking about Leviticus as well, the theme of Leviticus, in my opinion, is seen in 19:2. It amounts to the phrase, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And I find this interesting because it can be viewed both as a command and as a promise. With the Israelites, we see that as a command, very obviously. And for us in the future, or perhaps in the present, I see it as a promise. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So here's the problem. Sin's consequences within the nation of Israel sometimes had an immediate physical effect. such as how lying or stealing from somebody would cause them to not trust the other. But sin always had a spiritual effect in that it deteriorated the relationship with them and God. The call from God was to be holy, and sin always destroyed that possibility. So, under the law, the sacrifices were the only way to restore a harmonious relationship with God. There was another requirement along with the sacrifice, and that was faith. The command in Deuteronomy 6:5, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength," made it clear that performing just certain physical rituals was not the most important part of the Israelites' relationship with God. Isaiah 1:11 tells us of God's frustration with the Israelites, and he calls them meaningless sacrifices because they did not demonstrate any love or faith in God while they were offering them. Okay. There was a view held that the sacrifices merely covered the sins of the people. However, when we read some of these passages, actually, let me pull this out now. We read some of these passages that doesn't exactly seem to be the case. Instead, it seems like the sacrifices did have a true cleansing effect. And here's what I mean. I'm going to look in chapter 4 and start off, just read a couple of those. In chapter 4 and verse 20, "He must do with the rest of the bowl just as he did with the bowl of the sin offering. This is what he must do with it, so the priest will make atonement on their behalf, and they will be forgiven." And we look in 26. "The priest must offer all of its fat up in smoke on the altar like the fat of the peace offering sacrifice. So the priest will make atonement on his behalf for his sin, and he will be forgiven." Over and over and over and over again, it talks about the idea of the sin actually being forgiven, that atonement is granted to them. And so this means an actual removal of the guilt and the punishment of sin. Another important note, with the exception of the sacrifice offered on the Day of Atonement, each individual sin required a sacrifice. In essence, the sacrifice effect only lasted until the next sin was committed. Essentially, one sacrifice for one sin. Okay? So the efficacy of the sacrifice, a lot of people will get hung up on this. Well, why don't we do that today? It's a good point. Why don't we do that today? It's because the efficacy of the sacrifice was not inherent in the animals. That's not what actually saved them, right? Or even the sacrificial ritual. It was God providing the atonement and forgiveness in view of the all-sufficient sacrifice that Jesus would offer on the cross. And we will discuss this at length as this class goes on. So I want to talk now about the different types of sacrifices. You don't have to remember I'm not going to quiz you on it, but you have essentially three types. Yeah, Robert.
One thing too about why the sacrifices, one thing that we see throughout the Mosaic Law is that sin requires death. Is that in order for there to be atonement for sin, there is always a death associated with it, in order for there to be true atonement.
Yes, and this is something, again, that we will probably get in much more into as this class goes on, but yeah, there is a lot to unpack just in that idea of what is a sacrifice and why is that important to God. So these three types of sacrifices, we have dedicatory, communal, and expiatory. Don't worry, we'll explain what they mean. With your dedicatory sacrifices, you have burnt sacrifices. This is basically how it would go. You could use those animals that are on the screen there, a bull, a male sheep, a male goat, a dove or a young pigeon. You had to lay your hands on the animal, and then the worshiper themselves slaughtered that animal. If it was a bird, the priest would actually do it. You would then skin and dismember it, and you would wash certain parts of it, and then the blood was splashed against the sides of the altar. And then the whole animal was laid on the altar and incinerated, the entire thing. You could also use grain as a dedicatory sacrifice. And it was either grain or barley, and it was usually prepared with oil. And it could be prepared either as a cake or a wafer of some type using a pan, a griddle, or baked in an oven. They always had to have salt. It actually makes a very specific phrase in one of the verses about not forgetting to use the salt on there. I think there's a connection, but again, don't want to get too off topic here. You also have first fruits offering. This will be a big deal as well. First fruits offering were heads of new grain, right, that were harvested. And instead of baking them into a wafer or a cake or something like that, you would crush them, and then they would be presented. Here's what you would do with that. You would give it to the priest. The priest would then pull a memorial portion, is what it's called, for the Lord, place that memorial portion on the altar, and the altar would obviously incinerate that. But then the priest got to have what was left over. That was their meal. So you can obviously see the importance of providing for the priest, but you can also see where maybe the temptation might be for the priest as well. You know, how much is too much? How much is too little? I think it's probably dependent upon their intention and their heart in that sense, and we see how Israel starts to slip that way. You also have drink offerings. It was going to be wine. Wine offered typically with other burnt offerings. So you would bring an animal, and depending on what type of animal that was, you would have a certain amount of a drink offering to pour out as well. Okay, moving on from the dedicatory, you have communal sacrifices. They came in three parts: a thanksgiving sacrifice, a votive, which is just a vow type of sacrifice, and a free will sacrifice. They were offered in a similar way as the dedicatory sacrifices. Interestingly enough, free will sacrifices, the animals were allowed to have minor imperfections. It talks about how if one has a shorter leg than the rest, that was okay to offer as a free will offering, but specifically says you can't use it as a votive. Kind of interesting. Don't want to get too lost in the weeds on that. The priest received a lot of those offerings, portions of that at least, as food for themselves. So there were a lot of communal sacrifices for all types of things that the Israelites would offer, and the priests would receive portions of that. Expiatory, if you want to know what that means, it's basically a sin or a guilt offering. Guilt offerings are kind of like if you were to rob somebody, right? You mistreat that person, or perhaps you mistreat God, you are required to give a guilt offering. Now, what that means is you are to wholly restore whatever property was damaged, lost, stolen, however you want to phrase it, plus 1/5 of the value. I think what it's getting at there, because we can read in Numbers 5:7, there seems to be a repentance component of that. Pretend I rob somebody, and then I just go on about my business. Am I going to come and give a sacrifice for that? No, right? And so that's kind of what it is. It's like, look, I messed up. I acknowledge I messed up and I did wrong. I want to make this right. So I'm going to repay what I've done, and I'm going to give extra. There's a repentance component to that. You also have sin offerings. They're usually described as unintentional violations of God's law. And for those, you can offer animal sacrifices, but flour is also accepted under certain circumstances. Again, don't want to get too hung up on those conditions. But those were your sin and guilt offerings. This word atonement, though, what does it mean? I thought this was made up. Like, there's no way. And I researched. This is what it means. It's a compound word. Just break it up. At-one-ment. To be at one with something. To atone something is to be at one with it. Sin, it's a rejoining of separated parts. And because sin ruined our relationship with God, we need to be at one with Him, atoned with God. And so this comes up all the time when reading Leviticus. It says that the priest shall make atonement on their behalf. So to make them one the idea behind atonement is to bring these things together that were separated, to make them one. In the case of God and the Israelites, atonement was a reconciliation of the relationship between something. Something had tainted or ruined that relationship. And the thing in the way was sin. It is the same with us today. For our relationship with God to be at one, there is something wrong that needs to be cleansed, removed, or repaired. So here's the priest's function in offering these sacrifices, okay? The priests were the vehicle, essentially, by which sacrifices could be made to God. They served as intermediary between God and the worshiper. But why would God's people need someone to intercede on their behalf? Why can't the worshiper just, I have the animal and the altar's lit. Why can't I come and just put it on here and we're good?
Possibly not been as clean as a priest is, and say the priest had to bathe before they go in and all the things. Now you've got Farmer Ted coming in with his sheep, and he probably hasn't bathed in a week or so.
Yeah, so kind of going back to that idea that I think is the theme of Leviticus, you shall be holy, for I am holy. If you've already sinned, are you holy? Not holy. Well, how can you be made holy? You got to be cleansed. But if you're not cleansed, then you can't offer something. You see the problem there, right? This was the priest's function. And just like you said, Christina, the priests were living in such a way, as ordained by God, to already be this clean, this pure type of group, right? God was putting in place a pattern for his people to follow. They needed to be holy to commune with him, and the problem was their sin spoiled that relationship. And they couldn't overcome that separation by their own works. Their works would not be accepted because they were still in sin. The people needed someone unstained by sin to offer something on their behalf that could cleanse the sin and make atonement for them. The priests were the specially consecrated group who could help the people achieve atonement with God. This begs the question, though, what happened when the priests sinned or were ritually impure? What happened then?
Is that not why they had levels of priesthood? Like you had your high priest, you had your, sorry.
No, you're right. Keep going.
I mean, so they, whoever, if it's the bottom on the totem pole, then you just go up one level. But I don't know what happens when the high priest says.
Well, now you're jumping ahead. I don't just stop.
Sorry.
So yeah, the specially designated high priest would act as the intermediary for the other priests in the same way that they did for the other people. But as we can read about with the golden calf, even the high priest was unclean at times and even sinful, and they needed atonement made on their behalf. So who could make that sacrifice for sin on their behalf? All right, I won't leave you in suspense anymore. This is where it connects with the book of Hebrews. Okay? The book of Hebrews will detail at length how Jesus fulfilled the role of being the world's, and more specifically, our high priest, by both living a life unstained by sin and also being the perfect sacrifice to remove all sin once and for all. The book of Hebrews also describes what we've discussed about this sacrificial system, and it calls it a shadow of the good things to come. So God was actually providing a way of atonement with these rituals and also foreshadowing the perfect way of atonement that would come for everyone. He was establishing a pattern for us to learn from and become priests ourselves. If you would, turn to Exodus 19, because I want us to look at this together. Because now we're going to really start to see, as it talks about, we see darkly only now, but in the future it'll be fully revealed, right? This is what it was. The Israelites had a small piece of this. Despite how detailed it was, they only had a small piece of what was to come. Exodus 19, in verse 6. God told the Israelites, "You will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Okay. Now flip over to 1 Peter. We'll see how this connects. Peter saw the fulfillment of this in our faith in Christ. So he writes in 1 Peter in chapter 2. And I believe it's verse 4 is where I'm going to start. I'm going to splice some stuff in here. "So as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but chosen and precious in God's sight." Now he's talking to us. "You yourselves, as living stones, are built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood and to offer spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. They stumble because they disobeyed the word as they were destined to do, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of his own, so that you may proclaim the virtues of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Peter wraps it up pretty succinctly, this idea of, listen, we had these sacrifices, and we were already moving in this direction. God had promised it in Exodus that God would have a people, an entire nation, a kingdom of priests for himself. We see that in Christ. He fulfills that role as the perfect high priest, unblemished by sin, and able to offer himself as that sacrifice. And what does that do in turn? It allows us to be that kingdom of priests that God was talking about. And Peter says so much right here. So I kind of wanted to point that out. That's basically all I have. I finished early, shocker. But we got a few minutes. Is there anything that somebody wanted to talk about, wanted more clarification about? Yeah, no one.
In the order of Melchizedek,
Oh, yeah.
Jesus apparently was supposed to fulfill that role in that same line, priesthood in the order. Apparently Melchizedek was the high priest.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will definitely talk about that. You've been reading Hebrews, of course. That is a huge topic within the book of Hebrews, how Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. The writer lays out that argument for why that's essentially a better priesthood than the Levitical priesthood and what that means ultimately for him and for us. So yes, absolutely. Jumping ahead. I saw Robert and then you, Jackie. Okay, Jackie.
So just kind of like piggybacking off that, so we know that the priesthood and, well, not necessarily priesthood, but sacrificial system was even before the, Moses and all of that, so a little bit, right? Do you
Yep.
think that it was somewhat similar?
So this is my opinion. I think what you're getting at is the idea of we have recorded examples in the Bible of sacrifices being offered to God, despite not having the law dictating how it needed to be done and when, where, and by who, right? My opinion on that is that God had communicated with them in some form or fashion and was able to detail what it is that he expected. I also think that as we see with the negative examples, Cain is the one that I'm thinking of, versus the positive examples such as Abel or Abraham or people like that, you still have that component of faith that's incorporated with the actual ritual itself that is probably more important, in my opinion, and that's why we get, it's almost like a bottleneck when the law comes. It's very restrictive as to how it is supposed to be enacted, and then it starts to broaden, not so much like we just don't care about this anymore, but there's something greater that is coming that's allowing more people to be a part of this that was predicted even way back then. That's kind of my 2 cents on it. We also have, frankly, examples from history that other pagan nations observed animal sacrifices. There was kind of a collective understanding of how sacrifices might work within theology. So you could, I don't want to get too far on that, but Were those false gods, demons that were communicating that? Was that some corruption of a pure sacrifice that they took and ran with something else? I'm not sure. We can talk about that outside of class. Robert?
I got something that goes on my mind whenever we look at the sacrificial system is, I have my own opinion on this, but I want to ask yours. Does the system, sometimes it feels like the system is intentionally flawed or that there's some sort of inefficiency within the Mosaic Law. Do you feel that way?
It's tough to answer that in one word because Paul talks about how the law was perfect, but then also talks about how it wasn't able to save. What does that mean? And so perhaps there is not so much an insufficiency or a deficiency, but more about this is what I expect, but you can't measure up to the standard still. And perhaps that's where I land on that idea. It even talks about, I can't recall the passage off the top of my head, but bulls and goats ultimately are not the thing that are going to save you, right? And so again, that's where I come back to, we have the prescription in the Torah of what God wanted as far as animal sacrifices, but yet faith was still a huge component of that. It was not just merely killing animals and yep, I'm good. Like, if anything, they were condemned. The Israelites were condemned far more often for that type of an attitude. 1 second. Mark?
When you talk about the different sacrifices, and whenever I read that part of Leviticus, God is so specific as far as what to do depending on the sin. Okay, so, and that is carried through and into the new covenant. He's very specific about baptism. He was very specific about the sacrifices, the pouring, the sprinkling, etc. Putting the hand on the head of the animal, where to put the blood. So specific that then he carries that over about baptism, about immersion. And then when he met with the disciples, he was very specific about how to take the Lord's Supper.
Yeah. God tells us things for reasons, I think is what it comes down to, right? He gives us his word for the purpose of knowing what it is that he wants. And kind of going back to my previous statement, the Israelites were condemned also for that. They just essentially ignored his word and chose to do whatever it is that they wanted and suffered the consequence of that. Over and over again, they're warned about that. James?
I think any inefficiency in the Mosaic law would always be the result of people themselves who violated. Samuel, the prophet Samuel had sons who were judges, and they took bribes, and then so they corrupted the law or the pursuit of it. And even he kind of alluded earlier about priests could take some food for themselves. We had Eli's two sons who would do that, who took what they weren't supposed to take. So, like I said, any inefficiency or corruption would be the result of man.
Yeah. I'm more of the opinion that man did it to himself as opposed to setting an impossible standard, if you will. Just frankly, our own greediness, pride, ego, simple desires, whatever you want to call them, get in the way of what God wants us to do. Still true to this day, is it not? Any other questions, comments? Okay, I promise. Next class, we will be talking about Hebrews. But I appreciate your attention, your comments, your questions, and I hope that you can see why it is that I wanted to start here. We don't maybe see it right this second as far as like all of the allusions to this type of system, but that's why I wanted to go over it so that you at least have the knowledge, you at least have the knowledge ahead of time so that when we come across it, maybe you'll have that light bulb moment or you'll be able to get a deeper, richer understanding of what it is the writer's trying to tell us. So thank you all with that.